In the heart of the ancient Roman world, a wedding was far more than a union between two people. It was a theatrical display of wealth, social standing, and family prestige. The ceremony was a public spectacle that could rival the most lavish feasts, gladiatorial games, or public celebrations of the empire. For centuries, Roman weddings were an essential part of the social and political fabric of the city, and families spared no expense to ensure that their children's marriages projected power, respect, and influence. The preparations for a Roman wedding began long before the day itself. Families negotiated marriage contracts that often involved detailed dowries, property agreements, and intricate legal arrangements. Unlike the modern conception of romance, Roman marriage was, at its core, a strategic alliance. Elite families sought partners whose wealth, lineage, or political connections could enhance their social standing. The union of two people was inseparable from the union of their households, which meant that even the smallest details of the wedding were a reflection of familial status. On the day of the ceremony, the bride would be adorned in the tunica recta, a plain but symbolically significant garment, sometimes dyed in saffron or orange hues, symbolizing purity and marital virtue. Her hair was arranged in the intricate sine style, 6 braids bound together with ribbons, and she wore the flammeum, a fiery orange veil that covered her face, symbolizing both her submission to her husband and the protection of the household gods. The groom, meanwhile, dressed in a toga virilis or toga praetexta, depending on his age and social rank, signifying his transition into manhood and the assumption of responsibility for a new household. Music, poetry, and ritual chants accompanied the procession. Roman weddings were never private. Neighbors, extended family, and sometimes entire communities witnessed the ceremonies. The couple would walk from the bride's home to the groom's, often under a canopy of flowers and ribbons, while a procession of friends and relatives accompanied them, singing songs intended to ward off evil spirits and bring fertility to the marriage. These public displays served dual purposes. They celebrated the couple, but they also broadcast the family's wealth and prestige, reinforcing social hierarchies in the process. Feasts were a critical part of the celebration. A typical wedding banquet would include an abundance of food, wine, and delicacies imported from across the empire. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh fruits, honey cakes, and delicacies such as dormice or exotic spices. The wealthier the family, the more elaborate the feast, which could last several days. Guests were not only entertained, but also reminded of the family's capacity to provide and maintain its status. These events often served as networking opportunities, with patrons, allies, and political contacts in attendance. Yet, beneath the surface of opulence, every aspect of the wedding carried symbolic significance. Flowers, oils, and perfumes were not merely decorative, they were imbued with ritual power. Certain herbs were burned or scattered to purify the couple and their household. Candles and torches were lit to invite divine favor. Even the order of events, the specific gestures of the bride and groom, and the arrangement of the guests had meaning. In Roman culture, the proper execution of ritual was believed to influence not only the success of the marriage, but the health and prosperity of the family for generations. Children played a role in many wedding ceremonies, especially among the elite. Young boys and girls, often relatives, would carry torches, flowers, or ceremonial objects, symbolically participating in the continuation of the family line. In a society obsessed with lineage, fertility, and inheritance, these symbolic acts reinforced the wedding's ultimate purpose, the establishment of a household capable of producing heirs. Even minor details were laden with social significance. Jewelry, for example, was not just ornamental, it served as a public declaration of wealth and taste. The bride might wear rings or necklaces that had been passed down through generations, signaling the enduring power of the family. Bridesmaids and attendants were similarly chosen not for friendship, but for social strategy, ensuring that the most influential allies were visibly associated with the couple. Despite the glamour, Roman weddings also carried an underlying tension. The display of wealth and power masked the fact that marriage could be a dangerous and morally complex institution. Women, though celebrated on their wedding day, were expected to submit entirely to their husbands and to adopt new household roles that came with limited autonomy. Political alliances could force marriages between individuals with no personal connection or affection, turning weddings into transactions rather than expressions of love. Yet the public narrative of grandeur and joy was essential. Any hint of scandal or weakness could tarnish the family's reputation, making every detail of the ceremony a high-stakes performance. Roman weddings were, in essence, a careful balance of spectacle and symbolism. Every element, the clothing, the procession, the feast, and even the rituals performed in the shadows, was meant to signal stability, fertility, and divine favor. The grandeur was intentional. It reinforced societal structures, asserted the family's place within the hierarchy of Rome, and celebrated the enduring continuity of Roman traditions. But while these public displays were bright and beautiful, there were darker, hidden layers that history would later attempt to erase. Behind the veils, torches, and flower-laden processions, certain rituals existed that were morally ambiguous, secretive, and even unsettling. It is this contrast, the dazzling spectacle above and the shadowy rites below, that makes the history of Roman weddings so compelling. What the public saw was beauty, order, and social harmony. What lay beneath, however, was a series of rituals designed to manipulate divine favor, ensure obedience, and control the unpredictability of human life and reproduction. Over time, the darker aspects of these ceremonies were deliberately suppressed or forgotten, leaving only the surface-level grandeur for historians to marvel at. In short, Roman weddings were a complex theater of power, social expectation, and religious devotion. They dazzled the eye, engaged the senses, and projected an image of control and perfection. But lurking behind the splendor were secretive practices, rituals that would horrify modern sensibilities and that were so dark, in fact, that they were gradually erased from history. The grandeur, therefore, was only the beginning of the story. To understand the full reality of Roman marriage, one must look beyond the flowers, the feasts, and the veils, into the shadows where ancient fears, superstitions, and morally troubling customs quietly persisted in ancient Rome. Marriage was far more than a union between two people. It was a sacred, spiritual, and highly ritualized contract that linked not only families, but the living to the divine. The Romans believed that their gods, spirits of the household, and even unseen cosmic forces played an active role in the success or failure of a marriage. Every step, gesture, and object in a wedding had symbolic significance, carefully designed to align human affairs with divine favor. Superstitions and ritualistic practices were interwoven with the pomp and spectacle of Roman weddings, revealing a culture deeply preoccupied with fate, fertility, and protection from unseen dangers. One of the central tenets of Roman belief was that misfortune, illness, or infertility could result from neglecting proper ritual or failing to honor the gods. This led to a proliferation of customs intended to safeguard the newlyweds. For instance, the bride often carried protective charms known as bulli, small amulets or pendants believed to ward off evil spirits and misfortune. Similarly, certain herbs, such as garlic, rue, and vervain, were scattered or burned during the ceremony, thought to purify the couple and the home they would share. Even seemingly mundane acts, such as sprinkling wheat or salt, held profound symbolic meaning. They ensured fertility, abundance, and the continuity of family lines. Omens played a vital role in wedding decisions. Romans believed that natural signs could reveal the favor or disfavor of the gods. A favorable bird call, the appearance of a particular constellation, or even the way fire flickered from a ceremonial torch could be interpreted as a sign that the marriage would thrive. Conversely, a sudden gust of wind, a stumbling of the bride, or a misaligned ritual gesture could indicate impending misfortune. Families often consulted priests, augurs, or soothsayers to read these signs, and ceremonies could be delayed or altered to appease divine forces. This emphasis on omens reflects a culture in which human agency was inseparable from the will of the gods, and where fear of cosmic retribution guided social behavior. Beyond these protective measures, fertility was central to many Roman rituals. Marriage, was intrinsically tied to the continuation of the family line, and couples were expected to produce children who would inherit the family's wealth, name, and status. Certain rituals were designed to encourage fertility, sometimes in ways that modern observers would find unsettling. For example, the bride's hair was styled in the sine crines arrangement, 6 braided locks tied together, which symbolized her readiness to bear children. The groom might touch the bride's hair or veil in specific patterns, a gesture believed to transfer vitality and fertility. Even the timing of the marriage could be chosen according to astrological or religious considerations, ensuring that the union occurred at a moment most auspicious for conception. Household gods, or lares and peanuts, were intimately involved in marriage rituals. These deities were thought to protect the family and home, and their approval was essential for marital harmony. Offerings of food, wine, and incense were made to these spirits, often in secret or private ceremonies, to secure their blessing. Some families even performed small sacrifices, presenting animals or symbolic objects to the gods in exchange for fertility, prosperity, or protection. These acts were not merely formalities, they reflected a deeply held belief that the unseen world directly influenced the physical and emotional success of the marriage. Romans also feared the presence of malevolent forces known as lemures, or spirits of the restless dead. It was believed that these spirits could bring misfortune, jealousy, or even death to a newlywed couple if proper precautions were not taken. To counter this, elaborate rituals were performed to ward off such entities. Torches were carried, loud noises were made, and symbolic gestures, such as stepping over thresholds in specific ways, were executed with precision. The goal was to create a spiritual shield around the couple, ensuring that no unseen force could disrupt the household's future. Yet, alongside these benevolent rituals, there existed practices that were morally ambiguous or downright dark. Some ceremonies involved symbolic gestures that represented sacrifice, submission, or control. For instance, the bride might be symbolically handed over to the groom's household through a ritual that emphasized obedience and transfer of authority. Though outwardly celebratory, these acts reinforced social hierarchies and placed women in positions of subservience, binding them to duties and expectations that were strictly enforced. Historical texts suggest that some rites may have included secretive, almost occult practices, performed only at night or in private spaces, which blurred the line between spiritual devotion and coercion. Divination played an important role in these secretive rituals. Priests and family elders sometimes performed complex ceremonies involving animal entrails, the flight patterns of birds, or the interpretation of dreams to predict the success of a marriage. Couples were often instructed to follow specific behavioral prescriptions based on these readings, such as abstaining from certain foods, wearing particular charms, or performing nightly prayers. The weight of these superstitions could create intense psychological pressure, revealing a society in which fear and reverence were intertwined, and where human happiness was believed to hinge on strict compliance with ritual law. Even the social performance of the wedding itself carried layers of superstition. Guests were not merely passive observers, they actively participated in rituals intended to protect the couple. Loud music, rhythmic clapping, and cheering were used to scare away malevolent spirits. Food was passed among attendees not only as a gesture of hospitality, but also as a symbolic transfer of blessings. Each participant, knowingly or unknowingly, became a part of a spiritual network, reinforcing the belief that the community's collective energy could influence the divine favor bestowed upon the marriage. The emphasis on ritual and superstition extended beyond the wedding day. The first nights and weeks of the marriage were often governed by strict practices designed to ensure the household's stability and fertility. Couples might be advised to sleep with specific arrangements, perform nightly prayers, or observe seasonal rites. Failure to comply could be interpreted as inviting misfortune or divine disfavor, reinforcing the idea that marriage was not merely a personal commitment, but a sacred responsibility with cosmic implications. In some, superstitions and rituals were the invisible threads that held Roman weddings together. They infused every moment with symbolic meaning, from the bride's carefully arranged hair to the placement of torches and offerings. While outwardly glamorous and celebratory, these ceremonies were underpinned by deep anxieties about fate, divine judgment, and human vulnerability. The intertwining of superstition, ritual, and social expectation reveals a culture in which marriage was simultaneously a public spectacle, a spiritual obligation, and a deeply controlled social instrument. It is within this web of beliefs that some of the darkest aspects of Roman weddings emerged. Practices so secretive, morally ambiguous, or disturbing that later generations would deliberately erase them from history. These hidden rituals, shrouded in superstition and conducted under the watchful eyes of both gods and family elders, hint at a shadow world of fear, control, and mystical calculation that lies just beneath the glittering veneer of Roman matrimonial grandeur. In ancient Roman society, the bride was far more than a participant in a ceremonial ritual. She was the axis upon which the household, family honor, and future generations would turn. Marriage in Rome was a transformation. In the most literal and profound sense, the woman ceased to belong primarily to her birth family and was fully absorbed into her husband's household. This transition was not only social and legal but spiritual, marked by rituals that symbolized the bride's submission, her readiness for domestic duties, and her crucial role in continuing the family line. What outsiders may have seen as a beautiful and celebratory ceremony was, in many ways, a meticulously orchestrated moment of control, obligation, and ritualized transformation. From the moment preparations began, the bride's life was defined by symbolism and expectation. Her attire, for instance, was carefully chosen not for fashion alone, but for its ritual significance. The tunica recta, the traditional bridal garment, was simple yet charged with meaning, often dyed with saffron to evoke purity, fertility, and the sacred flame of the household. Over her head the bride wore the flammeum, a long veil of bright orange or red, covering her face like a curtain between her past life and the new world she was entering. This veil symbolized the protective shadow of the household gods, Lares, and Peanuts. The spiritual boundary between her family of origin and her future family. The veil concealed her identity, making her both sacred and, in a sense, owned by the new household she was joining. Hair in Roman weddings was never mere decoration, it was a canvas of symbolic power. The sine crine's hairstyle, composed of 6 braided locks bound together, represented both virginity and the bride's readiness to fulfill her role as wife and mother. Each braid was a tangible reminder of the threads of obligation she was weaving into the fabric of her husband's family. The groom would sometimes touch or adjust these braids during the ceremony, a gesture thought to pass vitality, strength, and fertility from him to her, a symbolic act that placed the bride's body and future children directly under the husband's authority. Even her jewelry carried layered meaning. Rings, necklaces, and bracelets, often inherited from her maternal line, served as both charms for protection and visual declarations of her family's status. Beyond the symbolism of clothing and adornment, the bride's psychological transformation was equally intense. In leaving her birth home, she stepped into a life of strict social expectations. Roman women, especially in elite households, were expected to manage domestic affairs with precision, controlling finances, supervising slaves, maintaining household rituals, and ensuring the moral and physical well-being of children. The wedding ritual itself often emphasized obedience to her husband and integration into the paterfamilias sphere of authority. The bride's submission was codified not only legally, through documents such as the manus, a form of legal authority transferred to the husband, but also spiritually through rites that symbolically surrendered her to the gods of the household and her new patriarch. This transition was often marked by rituals that may seem unsettling to modern eyes. One particularly striking act involved the bride being led across the threshold of her new home, a symbolic taking possession by her husband. She would sometimes carry a flame or other sacred object, demonstrating her role as the keeper of the household hearth. While outwardly ceremonial, these acts reinforced the hierarchy. The bride's personal autonomy was intentionally diminished, replaced by an obligation to serve her husband, bear children, and manage the spiritual and material affairs of her new household. Some ancient texts suggest that these rituals could also include symbolic gestures of sacrifice, acts representing her willingness to be bound to the household's welfare at the expense of her own individual desires. The bride's role extended beyond domestic duties. She was also central to religious life. Roman women often acted as intermediaries between the household and the gods, performing daily prayers, offerings, and protective rites. A bride's success in these religious obligations was believed to directly influence the prosperity of her new household. Fertility rituals were particularly critical. In some ceremonies, the bride's virginity was ritually celebrated not just as a moral virtue, but as a spiritual force, a conduit through which divine blessing could flow into her future children. Certain obscure rites may have included nocturnal or private ceremonies, attended only by women or priests, in which fertility and protectio from spiritual harm were invoked. These practices highlight the dual nature of the bride's transformation. She was at once celebrated and ritualized, revered and constrained. Marriage also imposed psychological and social pressures on women. While the bride was the focal point of lavish feasts, public processions, and social acclaim, her personal desires were secondary to the needs of the family. She had to navigate complex social expectations, maintaining the household's reputation while ensuring obedience to her husband and in-laws. Failure to conform could have dire consequences, not just for her reputation but for her family's social standing. Missteps in ritual, negligence in domestic duties, or perceived moral failings could invite social censure or even divine disfavor, according to prevailing beliefs. In addition, the bride's transformation was not simply a matter of submission, it was a carefully constructed performance of identity. Friends, relatives, and guests acted as witnesses to her transition, amplifying the societal pressure and reinforcing her new role. Every smile, bow, and gesture during the ceremony carried weight. She was simultaneously an object of beauty, a symbol of family honor, and a participant in spiritual rituals designed to align human life with divine will. The layers of expectation created a tense intersection of personal, social, and spiritual responsibilities that would define her life for decades to come. Yet, within these public and ritualized roles, there were also secrets and darker undercurrents. Some historical accounts hint at rituals conducted behind closed doors, in which the bride's obedience and readiness were tested through. Private ceremonies that blurred the line between spiritual duty and coercion. Certain fertility rites may have involved symbolic and sometimes literal representations of sacrifice or submission. Though later historians often omitted these practices, the archaeological record and fragmented writings suggest that the bride's transformation could be morally and psychologically intense, shaped by fear, superstition, and social control. In essence, the Roman wedding was not merely a celebration, it was an initiation into a complex, hierarchical, and morally charged system. The bride emerged from her birth family, adorned in ritual garments and veils, braided hair, and sacred charms, entering a new household where she was expected to be obedient, fertile, and spiritually vigilant. She became simultaneously a social emblem, a domestic manager, and a spiritual conduit, her personal desires secondary to the expectations of gods, family, and society. Her transformation was total, ceremonial, and permanent, a ritual shedding of one life and a careful integration into another, where success or failure was judged not only by family and society, but by divine forces believed to watch her every step. Understanding the bride's role in Roman weddings is essential for grasping the darker, hidden aspects of these ceremonies. The public spectacle, while dazzling and beautiful, masked layers of control, fear, and ritualized power. The transformation of the bride, her body, her autonomy, and her spiritual identity was central to the marriage's purpose and to the household's perceived survival. Behind the flowers, torches, and festive music lay a series of secretive, morally ambiguous, and times sinister practices, which would later be erased from history. These hidden rituals remind us that Roman weddings were as much about shaping and controlling women as they were about celebrating unions, and that the grandeur of the ceremony often concealed a world of shadow and obligation. While Roman weddings are often remembered for their grandeur, feasts, and processions, a shadowy world of secretive and morally ambiguous practices lurked beneath the surface. Not all rituals were performed openly or recorded in the official histories. Some were conducted behind closed doors, whispered about among select participants, or deliberately suppressed in later writings. These hidden practices, tied to superstition, fertility, and social control, reveal a side of Roman matrimony that was far darker than the dazzling spectacles witnessed by the public. The secrecy of these rituals was deliberate. Roman society placed immense value on appearances. Public displays were meant to impress, reassure, and reinforce hierarchy, while private ceremonies ensured that spiritual and supernatural obligations were met. Some historians suggest that the more extreme or forbidden practices were considered too dangerous or morally transgressive to be documented openly. These included rites designed to manipulate fertility, ensure obedience, or avert the wrath of spirits. The secrecy also served a social function. It reinforced the authority of elders, priests, and family patriarchs, who alone could interpret or conduct these rituals correctly. One common hidden practice involved fertility rites that were intentionally symbolic, but could verge on disturbing. While public ceremonies rated the bride's readiness to bear children, private rituals sometimes focused on activating fertility in ways that were mystical and, to modern observers, morally ambiguous. Some texts hint at the use of figurines, charms, or symbolic sacrifices performed in the dead of night, in which the bride was guided through motions that represented submission to divine forces. These acts were believed to imbue the couple with supernatural fertility, but they also reinforced the bride's subservience and underscored the household's control over her body and reproductive power. Divination played a critical role in these clandestine ceremonies. Priests, augurs, or specially trained family members would read omens from the entrails of animals, the flight of birds, or the patterns of flames during nighttime rituals. These secretive ceremonies were often conducted in private rooms or courtyards, away from the eyes of general guests. Couples were expected to comply strictly with instructions, which could involve behavioral restrictions, repeated prayers, or ritual gestures performed over days or weeks. The belief was that failing to follow these prescriptions could invite misfortune, infertility, or even death, linking fear directly to obedience. Some hidden practices also involved protective magic and curses, a more sinister element of Roman wedding culture. Families feared the envy of neighbors, rival households, or malevolent spirits, known as lemures. To shield the newlyweds, practitioners sometimes employed binding charms, protective spells, or symbolic offerings. In extreme cases, it is suggested that figures representing potential threats, sometimes even human-shaped dolls, were ritually harmed to divert evil away from the couple. Though the historical record is fragmentary, these practices hint at a culture where spiritual warfare was waged quietly alongside social celebrations, blending fear, superstition, and the desire for control. Another category of hidden ritual was concerned with the bride's obedience and moral conditioning. Certain ceremonies reinforced her new role as a submissive wife and manager of the household. In private, she might undergo symbolic acts that represented her transfer from her birth family to her husband's authority. These could include walking through flames, touching sacred objects in prescribed sequences, or performing acts that signified the shedding of her old identity. These rites were intended to ensure that she internalized the expectations of her new household, blending spiritual symbolism with social control in ways that could be psychologically intense. In some cases, the line between ritual and coercion became blurred. There are references in ancient texts to practices that involved isolation, fasting, or symbolic tests of the bride's readiness and obedience. Though not violent in the literal sense, these acts could be emotionally or spiritually taxing, reinforcing the idea that marriage was a realm of strict compliance under the watchful eyes of both the family and the gods. The secrecy of these rites made them particularly powerful. The bride was aware that the success of the household, and even her own spiritual safety, depended on her proper participation, creating an atmosphere of fear intertwined with devotion. Cultural prohibitions also influenced what could be performed publicly versus privately. While some rituals, such as offerings to household gods or fertility charms, were considered acceptable, others were viewed as taboo. Activities perceived as too magical, morally ambiguous, or potentially dangerous were conducted in secrecy or deliberately suppressed from written records. Over time, as Roman society evolved and Christianity gained influence, many of these clandestine practices were erased entirely from historical memory. The surviving fragments often hint at something darker, leaving modern scholars to speculate on the full extent of the rituals. The psychological and social impact of these hidden practices cannot be overstated. The bride, as the central figure in many of these rites, experienced a transformation that was both visible and invisible. Publicly, she was celebrated and adorned. Privately, she was trained, tested, and symbolically submitted to forces beyond her control. The rituals reinforced hierarchies within the household, elevated the authority of elders and priests, and perpetuated the belief that divine forces could influence every aspect of life. In a society where appearances were paramount, these secret ceremonies ensured that nothing was left to chance, even if it meant imposing morally and spiritually complex practices on the participants. Perhaps the most striking aspect of these hidden rituals was their erasure from official histories. Later moralists, Christian chroniclers, and Roman reformers found these practices unsettling, dangerous, or shameful. They deliberately omitted, censored, or sanitized references to them, leaving only vague hints in surviving documents. This historical suppression adds to their allure and horror. Modern readers are left piecing together fragmented evidence, imagining the ceremonies that combined fear, superstition, control, and secrecy in ways that would shock even contemporary observers. Ultimately, these hidden rituals reveal the duality of Roman weddings. The public face of beauty, feasting, and social celebration was matched by private, secretive ceremonies that reinforced obedience, manipulated fertility, and warded off unseen threats. These practices were morally complex, psychologically intense, and deeply intertwined with superstition. They remind us that beneath the surface of ancient Roman culture, social and spiritual power was carefully choreographed and often hidden in the shadows. The grandeur that survives in historical accounts was only one layer of a much darker, more enigmatic reality. The existence of these clandestine rites underscores why some Roman wedding practices were so disturbing that history effectively erased them. They were rituals that balanced on the edge of fear, devotion, and control, blending superstition, magic, and obedience in ways that modern readers can scarcely imagine. While we can marvel at the public spectacle of Roman weddings, it is these hidden practices, the forbidden, the secretive, the morally ambiguous, that truly reveal the intensity and darkness underlying the institution of marriage in ancient Rome. As the Roman Empire evolved, many of the elaborate, secretive, and sometimes morally ambiguous wedding practices gradually disappeared from public knowledge. What survived in historical records was often a sanitized version of events: the colorful garments, the public feasts, and the impressive processions. Yet the darker, more secretive rituals, the fertility rites, the tests of obedience, and the occult ceremonies vanished from the mainstream narrative, leaving only fragmented references and tantalizing hints. Understanding why these practices disappeared provides insight not only into Roman culture, but also into the way history itself is written, censored, and shaped by moral and social pressures. One of the primary reasons these practices were erased was moral transformation within Roman society. By the later Republican period and into the imperial era, Roman moralists and philosophers began to emphasize order, decorum, and the cultivation of virtue over superstition and secret rites. Authors such as Cicero, Seneca, and later Christian chroniclers sought to portray Roman life in ways that reflected their ethical ideals. Practices that involved secrecy, coercion, or morally ambiguous fertility rituals were increasingly viewed as improper or shameful. They were described vaguely, criticized indirectly, or omitted entirely, creating a historical record that highlighted the public grandeur while obscuring the hidden and darker aspects of matrimonial rites. The rise of Christianity in the Roman world further accelerated this erasure. Christian writers and authorities condemned pagan rituals, especially those connected to magic, fertility, or submission of women, as sinful or evil. What had once been considered practical, spiritual, or socially necessary became dangerous or morally corrupt. As the empire adopted Christian moral codes, the recording and continuation of secret wedding rituals declined sharply. Temples closed, pagan priests lost influence, and the rituals themselves were either abandoned or adapted into new religious frameworks. Historians of the Christian era often deliberately ignored or censored these practices, leaving a historical vacuum that made the rituals seem more mysterious and sinister than they may have originally appeared. Political change also contributed to the disappearance of certain practices. Roman weddings were not merely personal events, they were tied to family politics, alliances, and social standing. As the empire centralized power and traditional aristocratic structures shifted, some of the more extreme or secretive practices were seen as politically inconvenient. Rituals that involved coercion, fertility magic, or manipulation of divine favor could be misinterpreted as threats to social stability or challenges to the authority of household heads. As the political environment changed, families became increasingly cautious about preserving appearances while abandoning practices that might invite scrutiny or criticism. In effect, the secretive customs were quietly retired to avoid scandal or political fallout. Another factor in the disappearance of these customs was the natural passage of time and generational change. Many rituals were orally transmitted, passed down from mother to daughter or elder to young initiates. As households evolved and families moved, the knowledge of these practices faded. Without written documentation, and with later historians deliberately censoring morally ambiguous content, entire categories of ritual disappeared from collective memory. What remained were fragments, brief mentions in legal texts, obscure references in literature, or archaeological traces of objects whose full ritual significance had been lost. Over centuries, these fragments were interpreted through the lens of imagination and speculation, further obscuring the original practice. The societal shift in the perception of women's roles also played a part. In early Roman society, the bride's submission, her performance of secret fertility rites, and her participation in occult ceremonies were considered essential to household prosperity. But as societal norms shifted, particularly under Christian influence, the explicit control and ritualized testing of women were increasingly viewed as oppressive or immoral. These practices were either suppressed or replaced with more socially acceptable public ceremonies that celebrated the bride without exposing her to morally or spiritually questionable acts. The old rites, once deemed essential, became obsolete and morally unacceptable, leaving only the public spectacles to define the institution of marriage in historical memory. The disappearance of these customs also reveals something about the construction of history itself. Ancient writers often had motives for what they chose to record. Political bias, religious morality, social propriety, and audience expectations shaped their accounts. The hidden and secretive rituals were precisely the kinds of events that could tarnish reputations, incite scandal, or challenge prevailing moral frameworks. By erasing them from records, writers could present a version of Roman weddings that emphasized honor, piety, and social order. In doing so, they left generations of historians and readers with a story of grandeur devoid of its darker, more enigmatic layers, a sanitized version of reality. Archaeological evidence offers glimpses of these lost practices. Small amulets, figurines, and ritual objects discovered in ancient households suggest that secret rites were once widespread. Some of these artifacts are linked to fertility, protection, or spiritual manipulation, hinting at practices that were deliberately kept hidden from the public eye. Graffiti, obscure inscriptions, and fragmented texts reinforce the sense that a hidden world existed behind the well-documented spectacle of Roman weddings. Yet without comprehensive records, the precise nature and full scope of these rituals remain mysterious, leaving historians to piece together their significance from indirect evidence. The erasure of these customs also amplifies their allure. The very absence of documentation has created a sense of forbidden knowledge, as if what we do not know is inherently more dangerous or sinister. Modern fascination with these lost practices stems from the contrast between the public grandeur, the feasts, the processions, and the costumes, and the hidden, secretive, and morally ambiguous rites that shape the bride's transformation and household stability. The mystery of what was deliberately erased adds a chilling dimension to our understanding of Roman weddings. They were not merely social celebrations, but complex, multi-layered rituals, some of which were intentionally obscured from memory. Ultimately, the disappearance of certain Roman wedding customs was the result of multiple overlapping forces: moral reform, religious transformation, political prudence, social change, and the natural loss of oral traditions. What remains in the historical record is a partial story, a dazzling public spectacle that hints at deeper, darker practices but conceals the full scope of the rituals. This erasure underscores the fragility of cultural memory and reminds us that history is often a selective narrative shaped by the values and priorities of those who record it. The hidden, morally complex rituals of Roman weddings were removed from collective memory not because they lacked importance, but because they challenged the ethical, social, and religious sensibilities of later generations. In their absence, the public ceremonies survived as the visible legacy of a deeply ritualized culture, while the darker, secretive practices became almost mythic, so shocking and morally challenging that they could only survive as fragments, whispers, and shadows in the historical record. It is this deliberate erasure that gives modern scholars, historians, and enthusiasts a sense of intrigue and horror. The rituals that were central to the spiritual, social, and domestic life of the Roman household now exist only in tantalizing fragments, leaving us to imagine a world where marriage was not just a union of two people, but a carefully controlled, supernaturally sanctioned, and at times morally complex institution. These lost customs remind us that history is not always a transparent window into the past. Sometimes it is a veil, hiding practices too dark, too secretive, or too morally challenging to survive the passage of time.